In this screencast, we'll see how the Rails view helpers work together with model validations and with the controller methods to allow us to call attention visually to errors that the user makes when creating an object that is invalid. We're on the Rotten Potatoes list of movies, and if we click the link to add a new movie, I'm going to set the rating and the release date to reasonable values, but I'm going to deliberately leave the title blank, which should cause the movie to fail validation. When I click Save Changes, sure enough, I see an error message that tells me why the movie couldn't be successfully created. But if we dig a little bit deeper, we can turn on the Show Element information, which we've used before, and we can notice a few interesting things about the structure of this page. First of all, if I click around this error message, we can see the part of the page that generated it has a div whose ID is warning. Now if we go over and look at the source code to our view, our Haml template, that's here because the warning div is explicitly part of the structure that we authored in our view. No surprise there. However, we can also see that the field corresponding to the problematic attribute of title has the class field with errors. In fact, there's also a label which is inside another div whose class is also field with errors. So we've got two divs, both of which have the class field with errors. One of them encloses the input where the user would type a movie title. The other one encloses a label corresponding to that input space. How did these get here? If we go back to our view, we can see that we use the built-in helpers, label, text field, and so on, to create these form elements. What these are doing is using the first argument as an instance variable. In other words, this movie symbol will be converted to @movie. And if @movie corresponds to an active record model that has failed its validation, in other words, the valid method returns false, then the form helpers will automatically add the CSS class field with errors to any such field. This is useful because we can take advantage of this to provide CSS styling that makes these fields visually obvious. If we go to our application.css file, I'm just going to paste in two new definitions that I created. This first one will style the warning, in other words, the information that errors prevented this movie from being created, by putting a red border around it and giving it a bold font. Also, whenever I have a div that has field with errors, I'm going to style the input, in other words, just the form field, to give it a yellow background and a red border to call attention from the user's point of view that there's something wrong with that field value. If I save the CSS file and I now reload the page, this will cause a repost of the invalid movie. Only this time, our warning has been properly styled, and the problematic field has been called out with a yellow background. The last thing to notice is that even when we submitted a movie with an invalid rating, when we go back to the movie view, even though the movie couldn't be created, the values that we had set for rating and release date are preserved each time. So how does that happen? If we look at the source for the controller method, we'll see that when the create action is called, that's the result of trying to click the Save Changes button, if the movie save fails for any reasons, we're going to re-render the new template, but keep in mind that @movie has already been set up with the information that we entered into the form. So the overall effect is that if the movie is not successfully saved, we will re-render the new template in Haml, but we'll have the @movie variable already set to pre-populate these existing form fields with the values that we used before. So those are the moving parts. The controller method's job is to make sure that the instance variable @movie is set up correctly for the template. In the template, by using the built-in Rails form helpers, we can automatically have CSS field with errors classes added to certain elements so that in our CSS file we can style those elements differently to call the user's attention to them.